I'm David Lombardino, Editor-in-Chief of DLA Editors and Proofers, here today to give you our tips for how to write an outstanding query letter. And so before I get into it, I'd like to give a few caveats, which is the tips that I'm going to give are the general tips or general advice that we give to our clients across a broad range of genres and types of manuscript. But whatever advice we give, make sure that you check with the individual agent or publisher that you're sending your query to. If they've got specific guidelines, follow those. If what they say goes against what we say, then definitely make sure that you follow their guidelines. And so that's kind of the first tip that we have, which is whatever agent or publisher you're sending your manuscript to, whether it's fiction, nonfiction, a screenplay, make sure that you know any particular guidelines or requirements of the agent or publisher that you're sending your query to. Don't just prepare one query and think that everybody's going to accept it equally. Don't do that. That would be a big mistake. That would actually show to the agencies and publishers that you're just sending it out blankly, that you don't care specifically about that agency or publisher and whether they would have any interest in your manuscript. So that's a huge mistake that you could make. In fact, think about why an agency or publisher would have maybe a slightly different requirement for a query. Well, maybe it's because they want to know if you've read their instructions. And if you haven't read their instructions, if you haven't bothered to read the guidelines that they would like for you to follow, then why should they bother to read your query and, even more importantly, your manuscript? And so that's our first piece of advice. Now, our advice for query letters does tend to follow a somewhat traditional or formal way of doing it. And that's because those ways work, and they still work even as we move into the internet age. And so the advice that we're going to give is going to work, generally speaking, for whether the query letter is being sent by regular mail, by email, or by copy and paste into an online form. And so the first step is put your address on there. Your name and address should be the first block of the letter. Now, traditionally, if you're going to be sending this letter by mail, that would be shifted over toward the right-hand margin. By email or by copy and paste into an online form, leave it flush against the left-hand margin, okay? Put your name, street address, city, state, zip code. Then on the next line, put your phone number, and on the next line, your email address. Put all of your contact information right there at the top. Then skip a line, put the date that you're sending the letter, skip a line, and put the recipient's address. Now, the recipient's address is going to be either the agency or the publisher that you're sending the query letter to. But as much as you can, be as specific as to the individual recipient at that agency or publisher that you're addressing your letter to. If at all possible, and do everything within your power to make it possible, know the name of the individual person who's going to be reading your query letter. Maybe the name of the person who's generally responsible for those query letters. If you're sending to a publishing house that covers fiction and nonfiction, for example, and you've got somebody that receives all the fiction query letters, then make sure that you're using that person's name. In other words, whatever type of manuscript you have, make sure as much as possible at each agency and each publisher that you're sending your query letter to, not only that you follow their individual guidelines if they have any, but also that you're specifying the name of the person who is receiving the query letter or who you anticipate to receive the query letter. The first line of that address block should be the name of the agency or publisher. Next line should be attention, first name, last name. No Mr., no Ms., no Mrs., nothing else. Attention, ATTN, space, first name, last name. Then street address, city, state, zip code. If for some reason you've tried every avenue possible and you still cannot find the name of the person that's going to be receiving the query letter or reading it, then you can leave that line out. The attention line, that is. Still put the name of the agency or publisher, then followed by the street address and the city, state, and zip code. Skip a line. Now, the next piece of advice that I'm going to give you is really kind of, there's nothing standard about it. It's just simply the advice that we give to our clients. It works really well, specifically when you're sending your query letter by email or by copy and paste to an online form, which is that you put in bold the word via, email or email delivery or online delivery. Okay, so you put via : email delivery if it's being sent by email, or via : online delivery if you're copying and pasting it into an online form. Of course, if you're copying and pasting it, you may lose the bold font, but nonetheless, it's important. We see it as an important step to take. And the reason why it's important is because that's a key detail that will indicate immediately to the recipient that you are taking this query seriously, that you consider this to be a professional endeavor of yours, to be sending this letter to them, and that you are putting forth the same amount of effort into writing the letter to them as you want them to put in reading the letter that you send. Skip a line, next line. Dear Mr. or Ms. last name. You don't put Mr. or Ms. in that address block above. You put Mr. or Ms. here. Now, you may debate whether you to put Mrs. instead of Ms. Our recommendation, don't put Mrs. unless you're absolutely certain that that's what the person wants to be called. And it's going to be pretty rare. So, when in doubt, put Ms. If you don't know, put Ms. You can never go wrong by putting Ms. So Mr. or Ms. plus the last name, : Now, why a colon? Some people may want to put a comma. Some people who don't know what they're doing may put a semicolon. Put a colon. And the reason is, like the via email delivery or via online delivery indicates that you're writing a professional letter. It indicates that you are taking this seriously and that you want them to take your letter seriously as well. A colon is the correct punctuation at the end of that line for a business letter. In terms of formatting and layout, what is also important for a business letter, in addition to the address blocks I described above, the via line, the colon, make sure all of your paragraphs are flush against the left-hand margin, but do not fully justify them. So what does that mean? There should be no first line indents of your paragraphs. Instead, skip a space between paragraphs. Flush them all. They should be left completely against the left-hand margin, but they should break naturally along the right-hand margin. They should not extend to be flush against the right-hand margin as well. Okay? So you want them completely against the left-hand margin, every line of the paragraph. And you want to skip a line between each paragraph. All right, now we get to the general structure of the letter, which is you want an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. For the introduction, you must state the title of the work, the genre of the work. What kind of work is it? Is this fiction? Is this a novel? Is this a screenplay? The intended audience. Now, when you're stating the intended audience, don't go on and on about what the intended audience is. 5 to 7-year-olds, preteens, just preteen females who love soccer. Be really specific and to the point. Do not go on and on. Do not use any more words than you have to. You can state whether, well, you absolutely must state whether it's a completed manuscript, and you can state whether it is your first manuscript. You want to say, I am sending you such and such, or I'm sending you this query regarding this, and then you provide the information, and then you end the sentence with "for your consideration." Now, if you've got all that information in one sentence, and then that's all you need to communicate in the introduction, it's perfectly fine for introduction to be just one sentence. Don't worry about it. You do have some other options for the introduction though, and these options are ones that you can either put in the introduction or you can put later in the letter, either as a conclusion, depending on how long or how much content it is, or as a penultimate paragraph, which I'll come back to in a moment. You want to provide, if it's relevant, any biographical information. And so if you're writing a book about how to build sandcastles, do not mention that you have a PhD in philosophy unless you are talking about the philosophy of sandcastles, okay? But if building sandcastles has long been a hobby of yours and you've entered and actually won sandcastle building competitions, then certainly put that in there. You want to provide all the relevant information that connects you as the author to the manuscript that you are querying about for their consideration. That establishes your personal connection to the manuscript. That also establishes your authority. What also establishes your authority, but in a different way, it establishes your authority in terms of your market, are some of the following items. Whether you've had works previously published, or produced, or accepted for publication or production, whether you've won any awards, whether you are a lecturer or regular guest speaker, or whether you already have, in other words, a built-in audience. This could be, for example, if you write a regular blog and you've got 5,000 readers on your blog. That's a healthy number. Make sure to put that in your query letter. In other words, your built-in market, the marketability that already comes with you, that you have ready to apply to the manuscript under consideration. Now, if this is just a few words, a quick blurb, can be done in kind of a nice tidy sentence, go ahead and feel free to keep it in there in your introduction. But if you're going to go past one sentence, kind of 2 or 3 sentences, go ahead and move it down in your paragraph. To a later paragraph in your letter. If it is just one short sentence, you don't have to keep it in your conclusion. You can move that, in your introduction, you can move that to your conclusion. For the conclusion, and I know I'm jumping around a little bit, your conclusion should state simply, thank you for your time and consideration. If you have like a one-line biographical information or marketing information, you can put that as a first line of your conclusion and then second line of conclusion. Thank you for your time and consideration. You could make those 2 separate paragraphs. It's perfectly fine for your introduction, your conclusion, and your biographical or marketing paragraphs to be 1 sentence long. Of course, if your bio or marketing information goes on 2 or 3 sentences, don't put it in your introduction. Don't put it together with that. Thank you for your time and consideration. For the conclusion, give it its own paragraph just before that last line as its own paragraph. So then what are we left with? We're left with the body or the paragraph or 2 paragraphs that describes the manuscript for consideration. Make sure that in this 1 or 2 paragraphs you cover all of the key characters and all of the key plot points. I'm not asking you to go on and on into detail. In fact, you need to keep in mind that your letter should be no longer than 1 page, even with the address blocks. And so you want to make sure that the body paragraph or paragraphs is balanced in terms of the right amount of detail to convey the information, to give the agent or publisher a great understanding, a complete understanding of kind of the manuscript that you have to offer, and to make them want to read more, and don't go any further than that. Don't leave them guessing in any way about any key plot points. Make sure that they understand the foundation for the plot or the context. Make sure they understand the key points, and make sure that they understand the conclusion right there in the query letter. Do not leave any of this out. Make sure they have a complete understanding of the key characters and the key plot points. On the key characters, don't give boring details. Give 1 or 2 key details that delivers quickly what makes that character engaging, and move on to the plot points. As much as you can in the body paragraphs, write the body paragraphs using our tone or writing style that mimics the manuscript. So if you write it in a tongue-in-cheek manner, if you've written the manuscript in a tongue-in-cheek manner, or it's a tongue-in-cheek manuscript, make sure the body paragraphs are tongue-in-cheek. Not the introduction, not the conclusion, and not the biographical or marketing information, but the body paragraphs only. You want to make sure that the writing style of those body paragraphs imitates the writing style of the manuscript. If you can't do that, or another way of looking at it is make sure that that writing style mimics your personality. So if you've got a funky manuscript, if you've written something about, say, like how to tie-dye t-shirts, at a birthday party in the summer, it's for 5-year-olds, and you want it fun and youthful, then make sure that your description and your writing is fun and youthful, like it kind of embodies what you've written. So then you get to the biographical or marketing information, you get to the conclusion, which I've already discussed. Finally, it's time to close the letter. You do so with either sincerely or regards, comma, and then your full name. Of course, if you're printing out the letter and you're sending it by mail, make sure to leave yourself enough room to actually sign it physically. If you don't need to do that, if you don't need to sign it because you're sending it by email or copying and pasting into an online form, then just go ahead and take out that extra space where your signature would normally go. It's perfectly fine to just type your name there. Don't worry about signing it and scanning it in. That's an extra step that often is going to be a hassle and may often keep you from being able to follow the guidelines that the agency or publisher has provided you, which often state that if it's going to be sent by email, they want the query letter directly in the email and not sent as an attachment. So again, make sure you're following the specific guidelines and rules offered or required by the agency or publisher you're querying. And as kind of a follow-up to that, a little add-on, make sure you check to see if there are any word count limits for the query letter. If there is a word count limit, say 150 words, and after you follow this advice, you're over that, then look to eliminate some of the non-essential items like the address block, for example. Or if you're filling out an online form and they ask for the title and the word count in other places in the form, then you don't need to include that information actually in the letter. I hope you found these tips useful. We would love to hear about what kind of manuscript you've got, whether we can help you with the query letter, the synopsis, the outline, the manuscript itself. We'd love to hear from you. Give us a call, send us an email. You can find us at www.dlaeditors.com. Once again, www.dlaeditors.com.